Hey, this is John Ridley.
And this is Matt Carey, documentary editor at Deadline.com.
Matt Carey, how are you?
Great. Very exciting to be in the throes of Emmy season, getting to the final voting. A lot of anxious filmmakers out there who are hoping for the best.
Well, I'll tell you, one of the things I really enjoy about what we do is that I get to see a lot of documentaries. And at this time of year, when you get to see the best of the best and everything that the peers really find of value, there's some good stuff. There's some really good stuff.
Yeah, I think it's been a really strong year. And as we've talked about too, I think there's a real contrast between what the Oscar voters, the documentary branch, recognizes and what the Television Academy voters tend to recognize, which I think, all things considered, is a good thing because it brings attention to a lot of different work. And of course, in the Emmys, you have series that are recognized and those would not be eligible for Oscars. But just in the whole picture, I think, we really get to shine a light, and the TV Academy does, on a lot of excellent work.
We sometimes bemoan that there may be these trends of celebrity docs or true crime docs. It was really nice to see that there were a lot of docs that were awarded that cover many categories. And even the ones that may be, quote unquote, a celebrity doc, one of the things that is the difference between just a celebrity, whether it's a biopic as a narrative film and a film that is a film, it's the filmmakers, it's the creatives who really rise above the tropes and those kinds of things. And I would say the majority of what we've seen has been really, really remarkable.
Oh, I think so. And the sort of a broad brush is painted about celebrity documentaries, that sort of thing. But to me, and I think to you too, it really comes down to how the film is executed. I mean, there's some fantastic documentaries about well-known people. And I think many times, let's say if it's about a music artist, in the case of Celine Dion, Irene Taylor film is nominated for Emmys in the category of exceptional merit in documentary filmmaking. I mean, that's the standard, is what have you done with your subject?
Right.
Well, what's the creative approach you have taken? And I think the nominees speak for themselves, be they related to true crime or celebrity or not.
Yeah, I think probably one of the best examples of that is one of the films that we're talking about today. And that's the film, well, actually the doc series, but it's Simone Biles Rising. And that's currently streaming on Netflix. It was directed and executive produced by Katie Walsh. And this has one of the big nominations, which is Outstanding Nonfiction or Documentary Series. So we're going to be talking to Katie in a moment. I think, Matt, another really good example of a documentary that rises above what would be considered, quote unquote, a celebrity doc is another film that we're talking about today. And that's Matt Wolf's Pee-wee as Himself. That's currently streaming on HBO Max. And that project has taken home 5 Emmy nominations. That's impressive.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Of course, this is about the late Paul Reubens, who everyone knows as Pee-wee Herman. And really that struggle that Paul Reubens had of kind of playing this persona, and yet who is he as a real person? And fascinating film. It's really a remarkable piece of work.
Guess what? I'm having a party, and you're invited.
It's weird to be in this situation having a documentary made because I'm used to having control of my alter ego. I wanted to be a performance artist. I could show you my characters. Out of nowhere, Pee-wee Herman popped out of me. The audience ate it up and went crazy.
When I first saw Paul as Pee-wee, I was like, who is this little man in this bow tie, and why is he throwing Tootsie Rolls at people?
Hollywood had taken notice. I mean, how could they not?
Remarkable piece of work. And Matt Wolf, I mentioned to you before, was somebody that I knew that I didn't know because I'd seen some of his documentaries on Criterion Channel, which, as you know, is the gold standard. Among the ones that he's done, Recorder, the Marion Stokes Project.
Yeah, I love
encourage
film.
everyone to check that out. He's a really talented filmmaker, and Pee-wee as Himself is a remarkable project. Here's our conversation with Matt Wolf, the director of Pee-wee as Himself. We are joined today on Doc Talk by the director of Pee-wee as himself, Matt Wolf. Matt, congratulations on the film. Congratulations on 5 Emmy nominations. How's it feel?
Thank you. Feels great.
I want to start with Pee-wee Herman, and we're going to talk about the film and Paul Reubens. But I'm a young man of the 80s, and he was everywhere. I remember working in a video store is where I first saw Pee-wee's Big Adventure, and it was just on a whole other level. You're a fairly young man. You were born, I believe, in the 1980s. What did Pee-wee mean to you before you even got to the documentary? And what was your experience with either Pee-wee or Paul Reubens, because he was an artist and did so many other things beyond Pee-wee Herman?
Well, as a kid, I grew up on Pee-wee's Playhouse. So I would say that show was probably my first real encounter with art. And I had a visceral, emotional relationship to it, but I wouldn't have been able to put words to that. But, I had that ubiquitous Pee-wee Herman pull string doll, and I put it on a hook above my bed. And, throughout my adolescence, even, it was hanging there. In my intro to photography class, I took an abstract photo of this doll, which still is on my, that photo is on my refrigerator today. So you could say Pee-wee was sort of part of my DNA. And I'm not like a fan in a normal way. I don't obsess over things and watch them 100 times. But I had a sense intuitively that Paul Reubens, the artist, was somebody who kind of fit into the wheelhouse of what I make films about, which you could say are often about unconventional visionaries, people who pursued avant-garde or experimental projects in the mainstream and faced certain consequences for that. And I wanted to meet him. I wanted to know more about him. I knew just on the simplest level that he went to CalArts during its heyday in the 1970s of conceptual art, and that Pee-wee was born in the kind of legendary Groundlings improvisation troupe. That was about it. And, I was not alone. Paul was very private. There was very little about him out in the world.
Yeah, the interesting thing is that Mr. Reubens, obviously, as Pee-wee Herman, was so present, particularly in the 1980s. And there were incidents in his life, we'll get to those, where he really withdrew and went away. Talk about, as you say, you were interested in a fan, but not necessarily, and I put it in quotes, fanatic. How did you arrive to Mr. Reubens, a bit of an introvert who wants to tell a story? You as a very, I will say, I don't know if experimental documentary filmmaker is the right phrase, but man, I've seen your work and it is high art. Just talk about you two coming together because, and we'll get into this as well, that coming together is a big part, or that working relationship, a huge part of the documentary itself.
Yeah, Paul was ready to make a documentary. He had been talking about it for several years and meeting with various directors, but for whatever reason, whether it was creative or personal, he didn't want to work with the directors he met. I think largely because they weren't willing to give him the level of creative input that he desired. I had tried unsuccessfully to reach him several times over multiple years. And then there was a rumor in the trades that the Safdie brothers were directing the long-rumored dark autobiographical Pee-wee film. And I knew them from our early days as filmmakers, and I reached out and said, if this is true, could you make an introduction to Paul? He's my dream subject. It wasn't true, but simultaneously, Paul had reached out to his friend, Emma Tillinger-Koskoff, a very celebrated producer, and he wanted her advice on how to pursue doing a documentary. She said, well, why don't you go to the Safdies? There's this chatter out there that you're working together. Let's talk to them. And they approached them, and the Safdies said, we know a director who we think would be right for this. And that brokered an introduction. So this was during the peak of COVID lockdown. Paul and I had Skype before Zoom was the dominant platform. And, immediately out the gate, Paul said, I want to direct a documentary about myself, but everybody's advising me against it, and I don't understand why. And I said, well, I'm here to meet with you about me directing a documentary. And maybe we could conceive of a process to work together and to figure out what the story is that you want to tell. And that began literally hundreds of hours of phone conversations and Zooms in anticipation of making the film. And you're right, I maybe wasn't the obvious choice, but then maybe in a lot of ways was. I had made films about a lot of artists, about queer people and queer history, and I work with giant archives. And Paul really couldn't define the film he wanted to make about himself, but the word that kept coming up was dreaming. And that's a word that I often use when thinking about my own films. Paul wanted to do something that wasn't a kind of streaming tell-all conventional thing. But, through those hundreds of hours of conversations, a lot of it was, how is this different from your run-of-the-mill celebrity biopic? And I always said to Paul, I want to make a portrait of an artist that really avoids the traps of this genre, which is, oversaturating our medium. But I want to do it in a restrained way. I don't need this to be experimental for the sake of experimentation. At the end of the day, it's about you directly telling your story in your own words. And so that all led through a very complex and difficult process to a major 40-hour interview with Paul. And leading up to that and during that, there was a significant power struggle, which was on full display in the film and throughout that process.
Your documentary about Mr. Reubens, to me, was far more than just a celebrity biopic in all regards. And I do want to talk about the creative end, because what I really appreciate in the film is the deconstruction of Paul Reubens as a true artist. And when you're going through the Pee-wee's Playhouse, which was the CBS morning show, and mind you, this was a time in the 80s where queer fear, homophobia was, unfortunately, is probably stronger now, but was strong then. CBS, probably the most conservative network, deciding to take an individual and put them on Saturday mornings where kids are going to see this person, but also the most avant-garde kids show, before SpongeBob, Ren and Stimpy and all that. Talk about the level of detail that Mr. Reubens would go through in putting on the show and the fights that he fought. And I don't want to say like mean, nasty fights, but standing up for your belief and how successful that was.
I mean, Paul was really a world builder. I think that's how I would define him as an artist. Yes, he had this kind of indelible alter ego and a character that was elastic, like a rubber band that he could stretch in all sorts of different ways. But I think what is so appealing, particularly about his first film, Pee-wee's Big Adventure, as well as his television series, is that he built a comprehensive world, unlike the one that we live in. And in Pee-wee's Playhouse in particular, it was a world in which creativity and self-acceptance and nonconformity thrived. So there were good values in that world. It was a world that really speaks to people who would grow up to become artists like myself. And so, yes, Paul had a very singular vision, but he also was very savvy and tasteful in terms of the collaborators he chose, whether it was Tim Burton, whose debut feature is Pee-wee's Big Adventure, or the artist Gary Panter, who is well known in the punk scene as a graphics person. He came on to build the set of Paul's early midnight theater production, the Pee-wee Herman show, and then would go on to design all of the sets. And there was like a veritable art factory that was creating hundreds and hundreds of drawings that Paul would choose to help make up that world. But all of his work was really came out of a tradition of improvisation in which a lot of people with varied skills and talents came together to create something. But it all revolved around someone with a certain kind of clarity of vision that made Pee-wee and all of the projects related to him so unique.
Yeah, he talks early on, he would watch Desi and Lucy, and he seemed to have a pretty good relationship with his father until his father suspected his orientation. But there are moments in the film where he talks about that yearning to go to Hollywood, that yearning, when he's around a circus, these are my people. And there's something so wonderful about that, because to me, it's that kid who just dreamed of going to Hollywood. And yeah, I'm different, but when I get there, the different people are going to accept me. And he made it happen, and talks about the first house that he bought, where when he dived off the diving board, he could see the Hollywood sign. And for him, that was like, this is as good as it's ever going to get.
Yeah, I mean, Paul was kind of a pretty radical combination of somebody who was very kind of attracted to the underground, originally with Warhol's factory scene.
Yeah.
And in a lot of ways could have come out of art school where he trained in performance art and been an underground performer in San Francisco in groups like the Coquettes or Angels of Light. He really thought that was his path. But at the same time, he was a child actor who was deeply ambitious and competitive. And he was unabashedly ambitious in a way that people usually aren't. And I appreciated that in terms of his candor about that. And I think he found himself in an unusual way getting into comedy. At the time, comedy wasn't king, it wasn't the dominant form of entertainment that we think of today. And a lot of stand up comedians were doing things that were experimental, people like Andy Kaufman, but others like Robin Williams were starting to get TV specials. So Paul finds himself in a place like the Groundlings at this incredibly fertile moment. There's punk, there's conceptual art, and there's this new kind of alternative comedy. And that's where his character is born. But at the same time, he still always had that obsession and drive to reach mainstream success. He was somebody who wanted to maintain a very alternative and radical creative vision, but to find a mass audience. And rarely do we see people achieve both. And he most certainly did in ways that I think were really unprecedented. And there is something so heartwarming when you hear Paul recall walking onto the Warner Brothers lot on the first day when he was about to make his first feature film. It's like he made it. He was like a showbiz kid who made it, but his path there was a very unusual and special path.
Yeah, one of the things I appreciate, at least I assume, I never met him, I don't know him, but to me in your documentary, I always felt like he respected the intelligence of an audience, that they could get it, that they were smart, that kids were smarter than we assume, that adults are, they can come down to a kid's level. You know, it's the Pixar formula and other people have picked it up. But as you say, in the 80s, that avant-garde, you know, whether it's David Letterman, as you say, Andy Kaufman, but it's like, hey, weirdness can be really, really cool. There's an aspect to your film that runs through that, to me, because I'm getting to be a certain age, that is incredibly powerful. And that was something that you were not aware of coming into this film. And that's the fact that Mr. Reubens had cancer. And at that point, I believe, well, certainly it came to be that way, but he was terminally ill, correct?
Yes. Completely unbeknownst to me, Paul was battling cancer and, you know, facing his mortality. You know, Paul was an incredibly private person. And the ways in which he opened up to me were highly, you know, out of character for him and challenging and scary for him. But there were still secrets, and a very significant one that I came to understand and appreciate why he may have kept from me. I think he didn't want his story to be told from the point of view of mortality. He was someone who endured these, you know, public scandals that really affected his life and career, and very adamantly never wanted to be seen as a victim. And so, in a way, when I made the film, his death and also the fact that I didn't know he had cancer didn't really change how I told the story. I wanted to tell the story in a very present tense way, but I wanted people at the beginning of the film, the beginning of each episode, to know this, for there to be a certain dramatic irony in the fact that Paul is sharing his last words, but to not constantly be thinking about his health or his mortality, to really be in the moment with this sort of genius figure who has never before shared himself publicly in the way that he does in our film.
When I finished watching the film and was aware certainly that he was passing, I was really, really reminded, one of my favorite films of all time, All That Jazz, you know, where Bob Fosse is similarly, you know, trying to capture what his demise is going to be. It's a film about time and running out of time, and my end and how I go is going to be like this. You know, Mr. Reubens knows he's passing. You don't. There is throughout the film a back and forth between the two of you about, you know, who is actually controlling the film. And the question, and even in the title, Pee-wee as himself, do you really think, and there's no bad answer, and I'm really asking for perspective, is this film ultimately Paul Reubens as himself, Pee-wee as himself, Paul Reubens, even knowing that you're directing this, because there are moments where he says, well, I'm kidding. Am I? Well, yes, I am. But am I? I'm not. Perhaps I am. Do you think ultimately, as a performance artist, that he is in control of his goodbye? And if he is, I have no problem with it because it was spectacular. I wish all of us could create our goodbye and make it bespoke, irrespective of how anyone else thinks about it. But as the director and stepping away, and I know you say you did not want to make something that just leaned into that, do you think Pee-wee as a performance artist ultimately got exactly what he wanted?
No.
Or Paul Reubens as an individual got what he wanted?
I think that Paul was somebody who created situations in which he had a lot of control, and in various aspects of his life lost control, particularly in terms of his narrative in the media. He had some tragic losses of control, and the question of his mortality is also a question of control. That was something outside of Paul's control. What he could control is how he engaged with me and engaged in this process. But our process also broke down. The film kind of was put on hold for over a year. And that's a time in which I don't know exactly what was going on, but I can only imagine that Paul was dealing with his health. So in terms of Pee-wee as a performance artist, or Paul and having the last word and controlling, your personal narrative, I think that, Paul was somebody who contained multitudes, but so are you, and so am I. There are many people within all of us, but Paul was a more extreme example. He's somebody who split between himself and his alter ego. And I think as documentary filmmakers, we often ask people to integrate different parts of themselves through telling their story. And that can be very uncomfortable and challenging or cathartic for people. And maybe it was a little bit of all of the above for Paul, but I think it was particularly difficult for him because of how he had chosen to organize his life internally and externally. So I think there's a lot going on in terms of Pee-wee battling Paul and vice versa, but also in terms of Paul having control and managing the loss of control. Most viscerally, and most visibly in this film, between me and him. Like there were aspects of our relationship he certainly could control. There were aspects of the telling of his story he could control. He could control what he says and what he doesn't say, and what he shares and what he doesn't share with me. Obviously, there were some big things he didn't share, but also Paul was struggling with the fact that as a filmmaker, I had final cut, and that he ultimately was going to be seen and interpreted through somebody else's perspective. And that was an idea that was really confounding to him, but it's something that he chose to do. And it was a source of conflict and ambivalence. And I think that's part of what makes him compelling to watch on screen, because you see him in real time grappling with these issues.
The name of the documentary is Pee-wee as Himself. It is currently on HBO Max. It's a 2-part doc series. You're speaking with Matt Wolf, who's the director. Matt, it is genuinely just a really terrific film. And as I said, from the first frame of the first episode, it really pulls you in. And I will say, the first frame of the second episode almost pushed me away because I was like having flashbacks to actors calling saying, hey, I got an idea. But I will say that ultimately what I really get from this film, and, it's interesting when you talk about Tim Burton and Pee-wee Herman and how magical that was for both of them and how that started a really, really terrific relationship. I think even though you clearly didn't plan it and wasn't aware of it, the two of you together in this film, you've created something that is really, really, really special. And I'm certainly not surprised that the Emmy voters have rewarded you with 5 nominations. So, Mr. Wolf, congratulations. Please, you are welcome on the show anytime. And in fact, I'd love to have you on sometime to talk about Recorder, because I thought that was terrific. But best of luck to you in the award season. Thank you, Matt, for joining us. Deeply appreciate it.
Thank you, Don, for having me. I really appreciate it.
Don, I'm so happy that you got to interview Matt Wolf. I got to meet him in person at Sundance and talk about Pee-wee with him there. That was a real treat for me. But again, one of the most talented filmmakers, I think, in documentary right now.
Yeah, I would second that easily. An incredibly talented gentleman and fun to talk to. He's he's smart and creative, and sometimes God doesn't give with both hands.
Well, I think that he made a really wise choice of sort of exposing the conflict and tension
Yeah,
between a documentary subject and the filmmaker. I mean, that's a really interesting and unusual dimension to that film. Really adds layers to it, and I think is just opens the lens for the audience onto what that process is like. Because often, you receive a completed film as an audience member, you don't really know what happened behind the scenes, and he lets us in on it.
yeah. You and I have talked about that as well. Right now, this push-pull as we see more celebrity docs, but also the creators who want to try to be objective and bring a perspective that is outside of the individual. And I did appreciate that. I thought it was refreshing. And I thought that irrespective of Mr. Reuben's desire, I think that partnership that he formed with Matt really helped make this documentary so much more than a celebrity doc. And I agree with you 1,000%, Matt. Sometimes seeing how the sausage is made, it's not pleasant, but it's really eye-opening.
And in terms of work that really shines an illuminating light on a public figure, that's our next part of today's episode of Doc Talk, where we look at the Emmy-nominated documentary series Simone Biles Rising about the, of course, absolutely extraordinary, mind-blowing gymnast and multiple gold medal winner, Simone Biles.
I've always had really good intuition about things, and unfortunately, I felt that way about the Olympics.
Simone is a once-in-a-lifetime athlete.
She's not just dominant, she is pushing herself.
Now, the greatest ever, Simone Biles.
Wow. Never in my life have I seen her do that. Never.
Yeah, this is a really powerful documentary. It is sensitive, it is timely, and it is impactful. Katie Walsh did an amazing job. Here's our conversation with Katie Walsh, the director and executive producer of Simone Biles Rising, which is currently streaming on Netflix. We are joined by Katie Walsh, who is the director and executive producer of the documentary series Simone Biles Rising, that is currently available on Netflix. I'm guessing you've all heard of Netflix. It is also nominated, one of the big nominations, for Outstanding Documentary Series. Katie, congratulations on both the series and the nomination. It's outstanding.
Thank you so much. I feel very honored. I'm in very good company in this nomination.
There's some great nominees, but you're very deserving. It's really a tremendous series.
Thank you.
I've got to feel like one of the hardest things is someone like Simone Biles, who is internationally known, a transformative athlete, a transformative human being. We all feel like, well, we know her. What is there not to know? And yet, from almost the opening moments of this documentary, revealing a person who is fully formed, who has the requisite ego, but also has those requisite insecurities or human nature or the things that all make us people, but some people are able to rise above and some people are able to deal. Can you just, and I'll also say before we get into it, one of the things I appreciated about the documentary, it's not just about a celebrity, it's about sport, it's about culture, it's about women of color and their place, but also one of the most demanding sports that we've heard a lot about. But once we really hear what's going on, man, Matt and I were talking earlier, this is a tough sport. Let's talk with Simone Biles. Let's start with Simone Biles, and particularly the 2020/2021 Olympics in Japan, and why that is so central to the narrative.
Yes. Well, one of the first things that Simone said to me when we were working on this project was that sometimes she said, I don't want to be Simone Biles. I just want to be Simone. And I always kept that in the back of my mind because I think it's, whether it was in Tokyo where she was, put up on a pedestal, expected to win everything, or whether it was in Paris where she was also pretty much expected to win everything. She's so used to having to sort of be this person and live up to a persona that's created around her. And sometimes you forget that there's a real person behind that. And, the Tokyo Olympics in particular with COVID was a real reminder that athletes don't exist within a bubble, and they need their support system, and they need their people around them, and they are humans first. And I think we saw that not just in, the experience that Simone had in Tokyo, but throughout the film in how she was, managing her life and managing her experiences. She's a human first. And I always tried to keep that as like the sort of the core when thinking about her, even though she's this amazing athlete, which, we all see, but it's what it is that's going on behind the scenes that, really makes her extraordinary.
And let's talk about that humanity for a second, because there's something that you've talked about in interviews. There are moments where her mother is braiding her hair, and something so fundamental. And it was very important for you to not just do the big, or not just do the struggle story, which is impactful every step of the way, but as you say, remind folks, this is a young person, my God, only 27 years old, but arguably one of the most famous athletes in the history of sport.
Yeah, and she's lived through so much in that 27 years, and her parents have been such a important role in not just supporting her, but in helping to guide her and steady her through this. I mean, she won the Olympics the first time in 2016. She was a teenager. You don't know how to handle that kind of stardom, and you need to have something to sort of touch down, someplace to touch down. And her mom was always that person for her, especially on the road. And, it's not about the hair braiding, right? That scene is not about the hair braiding. It's about having a quick moment where you get to actually just connect and be together. And that's what we tried to kind of always take the macro and the micro. I always thought to myself, there's this like sort of big picture persona of who Simone is that we all see from the outside, but we don't always understand like what it takes on the, on the smaller perspective, like what she sees versus what we see when we see her. And I tried to really find that balance between those two worlds.
And we see in 2021, which is when the Tokyo Olympics actually happened. Of course, they were postponed a year because of the pandemic. But it was really a collision of so many factors that in the end, Simone, she began the competition, and then she had a kind of disorientation when she would be, say, doing the vault or on the floor exercise, where she would get up in the air and kind of lose her place. And as it's explained very well in your series, of losing the connection between body and mind. And it's extraordinarily dangerous, because if you're doing flips, I mean, there's always the risk that you could come down right on your head. I mean, it's super dangerous. And that it was this, again, collision of factors where she, because of the pandemic, her family couldn't travel with her. They literally were in a bubble. As her coach explains, all they were doing was gymnastics. There was nothing outside of it, no social contact, no nothing. And it all conspired to create this situation where she had a sort of a mental health crisis. And then, as we see in your series, she gets criticized terribly for quote unquote abandoning the team, which is terribly unfair. It really puts us right in the middle of what happened, why it happened, and helping us understand the weight on her shoulders and how she was doing her best to just kind of stay alive, literally, in the midst of that.
Yeah. And, I think that was one of the things that we wanted to do in the film, is really try and explain what happened and why what she did in that moment by choosing herself, choosing her health and well-being, was so extraordinary. I mean, there's so much expectation on her, so much pressure, so many people that were really quick to just weigh in and make a judgment and make a decision on her and who she is as a person based off that one decision. And I hope that when you peel back the layers of the onion, you see that, what was so extraordinary about that moment to me is the fact that she was able to say no and walk away. I mean, you've got to imagine, like, you're at the Olympic Games, you're on primetime television, your adrenaline must be through the roof. I mean, she's Simone Biles. She can do everything. You know, I can see a world where it would be so hard even for her to even kind of come to the conclusion in that moment that that was not the right thing to do, and with so much pressure and so much expectation, and she's a young woman to be able to make
Yeah.
that decision in that moment so quickly and so firmly. I think it speaks volumes to her character and who she is as a person. And you know I don't think she realized in the moment what a great example she was setting for other people, especially other young women, to stand up for themselves and take care of themselves and put themselves first. And that moment was a launching point to such a bigger
Mhm.
conversation about mental health for not just athletes but for all of us in the human race. And she did an amazing job, being launched into that world where she suddenly became a spokesperson and advocate for that, while still figuring it out for herself.
Mm. Yeah, I think it really was a heroic act. And again, we can say that now from our vantage point of 2025, but that's not the way it was greeted initially, really. I mean, some people were supportive of her. Those in gymnastics, I think, understood what she was going through and how brave it was. But, she really shows what kind of character she has. And as you explain in the film, she had to kind of go through a reckoning with past trauma. And again, this is another thing people forget about, but she's been in the sport long enough that she went through the era of Larry Nassar. And for those who don't remember
Mm.
that name, this is the horrible individual who was the athletic trainer, I guess, for the women's gymnastics team, who was later convicted of an enormous number of charges of sexual abuse of these athletes. And so Simone was dealing with so much of not only the pressure that would apply, well, there's only a handful of athletes who've ever faced that kind of pressure and success. Maybe a Michael Phelps, a few others. But there was a lot in her past that she really needed to work through. And then to emerge, to come back in Paris.
Yeah,
It
yeah.
is one of the most extraordinary stories, certainly in sport. You can really take it beyond that. It's ever been told.
We were still in the process of making the film when it was first kind of launching the first two episodes. So we didn't know the ending.
Oh,
We're at the point
Wow.
interesting.
in the film where we don't know how it's going to end. We don't know if she's going to do well in Paris. We don't know what's going to happen. And
Wow.
so it was a really interesting journey to be on because I felt very responsible. I mean, you always feel responsible for your story and your subject, but knowing that the film was coming out before she was even competing and was going to have to address some really difficult subjects, being the story of Larry Nasser and just the challenges she's faced in her life, and obviously the mental health struggles that she had in Tokyo. And so but I do think that when you understand everything that she's been through, when you then see her do so well in Paris, it makes what she's doing out on that gymnastics floor so much more extraordinary because you understand all the experiences and the life that she's lived behind that. It's not just about being the best athlete. It's about being able to figure out how to put it all together in those moments and to rise above what all these different challenges that you faced along the way and then be able to put it out there. So we were very happy to see her do well. We had no idea.
Ah.
Did you have a plan B for an ending?
I had a plan B, a plan C, a plan D. And,
There you go.
the truth is, though, whether she won all the medals like she did or whether she didn't win any, I don't think it makes her journey and her story and her success, I don't think it diminishes that. I think that was all still there. So,
Yeah.
just putting herself back into that environment and showing up at the Olympics was such a huge win. So it was certainly icing on the cake to see her take home a bunch of medals too.
I'm curious for you because obviously Simone Biles, the athlete, as I mentioned, has the requisite ego. And you talk about Simone Biles, the person, and what she's been through and the difficulty. But when she's on camera speaking as herself, there's a confidence, a relaxedness. What was your journey as a director to get her to the place where she could be herself and feel like she had a partner in you? And clearly that partnership was very successful based on the film itself, the series itself, as well as the nomination. Was it just a cup of tea together? Was it a few long walks? How did you build that relationship?
I had the privilege of working with Simone since 2019.
Okay.
So we have worked together. I've spent time with her family. I lived through that Tokyo experience with her. And we stayed in touch. Before we really dove into the Netflix film, we were still in touch in those, like, in the time in between. So I think it was a very natural relationship that we developed. And, I just had time. I mean,
Hmm.
there's nothing better than that, right? And then I think also just building that trust and knowing that we were, we became part of her team. Her circle is small when she gets to those competitions where there's so much noise and so much pressure, and you have to shut out a lot. And she, to her credit, allowed us to be part of that inner circle. And we were very respectful of that and made sure that we were putting her and her needs first as a person before the
Hmm.
project. And that's sort of the orientation I try to keep at all times, knowing that, she had a job to do, and it
Hmm.
wasn't to make a film. That was my job, but her job was the much harder, much more stressful, and the number one job that needed to be handled. So I think as long as we kept our orientation and she knew that we were going to, I think she could trust in the process that we were there for her in that way. And that only allowed us more access to her
Hmm.
because she knew that we weren't going to take advantage of that.
I will say for the audience, I know a lot of what we're talking about, it sounds like, oh my gosh, this is a heavy documentary. It certainly doesn't pull its punches, but it really does remind you that there is a humanity. And what is the cost of, okay, we want more sport, whether it's football, 17 games is not enough. We want that other game. We see all these basketball players who are ripping their Achilles. Baseball players who, when I was younger, I used to joke about, oh, that's the game I would play. You can chew tobacco and drink beers while you're playing it, but we see injury atop of injury. I'm curious for you, I saw the documentary and I really was like, what are we doing to young people? And I'm curious, you're working around athletes, and I maybe a question I can't ask objectively, but where do you see sport going? Do you think there's going to come a point where athletes really start to collectively bargain more in terms of their mental health? We see people like Michael Phelps, who you mentioned, Naomi Osaka, who are saying, you know what? It ain't worth it. And I'm curious whether you see athletes start to really advocate for, you know what? When season's over, no G League. I ain't
Yeah.
playing basketball in Russia. Women's basketball players, thank God they finally got chartered flights, but, the world of sport, they're getting paid not nothing, but nothing. I'm
Yeah.
curious for you, as someone who's been around this and seeing it become entertainment beyond entertainment, what are your feelings about the future of athletes and what we, and I'm talking about me, not you, the paying audience, what we're doing to young people?
Well, I think, we are starting to see a shift. I think Simone played a big role in that shift. Michael Phelps, Naomi Osaka, all of these amazing athletes who have spoken up and said something. And it's, you know, before those three and before Simone, especially being that she was on such a global stage at the Olympics in Tokyo, before she stepped aside, like I don't remember hearing much conversation about the mental well-being of athletes. And now I feel like
Hmm.
it's coming up often and I'm hearing it often. And that's a change. And I think that's a change for the better.
Hmm.
I'm also seeing, in sports like gymnastics where you tend to excel and, reach the height of your career often as a teenager, that's starting to shift. Before Simone won the Paris Olympics as a 20 something year old woman, there had not been an all around champion who had been older outside of her teens since
Hmm.
1972, being that it started with Nadia in 76. She was 14. And after that, it was all teenagers who won the Olympics for
Wow.
gymnastics. So you're seeing a shift. And Simone's been a big part of that shift and being able to uh, not only exist in the sport, but dominate and have success in the sport well into her 20s has opened the door for so many other athletes to continue their careers, especially in gymnastics. But I'm seeing that also in other sports like figure skating, where
Hmm.
same thing, you tend to excel and reach the height of your career at 16, at 18. Now I'm seeing athletes that are in their 20s, even their 30s. So there is a shift that's happening. It's a bit of a glacier. It doesn't move fast, right? But I do see increased conversation around mental health. I see an improved training method so that athletes can last and exist longer in their sport. So I hope that's the direction we're going, because by allowing athletes time to really, improve and perfect their craft and grow as humans, you're just getting a whole nother level of athlete, and that's a really good thing for not just gymnastics but all sports.
I just wanted to ask one other thing about the title of the film, because we see what it relates to, and this is a quote from Maya Angelou that Simone has tattooed on her, "And Still I Rise," which a lot of people probably are familiar with, but that's a very touching part of the film of what that means to her.
Yeah, it was, naming this film was one of the easiest decisions we made, which, I can't say about every project, right? But early on, Simone had that tattoo, and, I thought about it. And, for one, if it's something that means enough to her to permanently ink it on her body, then it's obviously something that is a guiding light for her. And obviously, choosing to pay tribute to Maya Angelou is, the who else, the highest honor, the most amazing wordsmith to be able to include and reference in this film. But it is also, I think it's really a great guide of what Simone has been through. She has risen above so many things in life, whether that's being a child in foster care, whether that's being, the only gymnast of color in her gym as a little girl, whether that's, later on having to become to learn what it is to be a survivor and try and, succeed in a sport with so much going on in the background, whether that's the mental health experiences she's had. She's risen above many different experiences throughout her life. And it just seemed like the perfect fit for this film and for her.
Oh, I think so too. And we want to congratulate you again, Katie Walsh, the director and executive producer of Simone Biles' Rising, 4-part documentary series streaming on Netflix, and you are nominated for Outstanding Documentary or Nonfiction Series. Congratulations, and thank you for being with us.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. This was such an honor.
Oh, it's our pleasure.
Thank you. Matt, this is honestly, an episode like this is one of the reasons I really enjoy doing Doc Talk. The films and the series are terrific, but I enjoy talking with the creatives and just how they approach these films and storytelling and the things that they do around the edges to really try to elevate the material to a degree that it really deserves the attention and the nominations that their peers are giving them.
And I think I would call myself genre agnostic. I'm very willing to go with any subject matter in documentary, and I think you are too. It's really about the execution, again, as we've been saying. And these films, I think, are very, well, series in one case, film in another, are very impressive with how they accomplish what they're trying to do. And they really paint very intimate, complex portraits of individuals. In one case, Paul Reubens, of course, and then the other of Simone Biles. So I think it's really, the TV Academy did a terrific job in nominating both of them.
Yeah, and not only in nominating both of them, but kind of, as you say, two completely different subject matters, two people who had the public spotlight, but, how well do we really know them? And two completely different approaches to how to build a relationship and or not build a relationship with your subject and still walk away with an absolutely amazing project. And next week, we're blessed. We have two more projects that we're going to be talking about that really, really are elevated. So I'm very excited about that. Do you mind if I mention what we're...
I don't mind at all. I would be fantastic. Yes, more Emmy nominees.
Yeah, one film and one that people are really, really talking about, and man, could not be more timely. That's Will and Harper, which features Will Ferrell and Harper Steele, and about their friendship. That is directed by Josh Greenbaum. That's currently streaming on Netflix, and I would really encourage people to check that out. That is another project that has been rewarded with 5 Emmy nominations. That is very, very impressive.
Yeah, indeed.
Another project, and this is a film that we are going to be talking with the creatives behind that. It is called Deaf President Now. That is streaming on Apple TV Plus as we speak, and it is going to feature the co-directors Niall DeMarco and Davis Guggenheim. And I'm going to say that this film, I was blown away. I really, really enjoyed it. And when you talk about the things around the edges, as you say, and what people do to really elevate things, I'm love sound design. I absolutely love sound design. And a documentary, in some ways ironic because it is about deaf people or people with hearing impairments, that leans into sound design is just genius. It starts with that, and it's genius every step of the way. So I'm looking forward to both of those conversations that we're going to have next week. So
Yeah, they're
hopefully
very
I will see you
impressive.
then.
Absolutely. I'll be here looking forward to those conversations.
And we'll look forward to seeing our audience. Matt, it's always a pleasure to spend time with you. Thank you very, very much for being here. And thanks to everybody. But exciting times, Emmy season, and we're going to have a really, really good episode next week as well. So we'll see you again on Doc Talk. Thanks.